Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in German history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1812, the village of Steinfeld in the Duchy of Nassau held secrets darker than any fairy tale ever written. What the brothers Grimm would later record as Aschenputtel bore little resemblance to the sanitized stories that would follow. The truth lay buried beneath layers of carefully constructed silence, in a half-timbered house where the sound of footsteps on wooden floors told a story no child should ever hear. The house stood at the edge of the village, where the cobblestone streets gave way to dirt paths that wound through the Taunus Mountains. Its steep roof and small windows cast long shadows even during the brightest summer days. The Zimmermann family had lived there for 3 generations, their name carved into the wooden beam above the front door alongside the year 1768. By 1812, only Wilhelm Zimmermann remained, a widower of 43 who worked as the village carpenter, his hands permanently stained with wood polish and something darker that the neighbors pretended not to notice. Wilhelm had married his first wife, Margarete Kaufmann, in 1798. She had been the daughter of a prosperous merchant from nearby Wiesbaden, her dowry substantial enough to secure the family's position in the village hierarchy. Margaret bore him 1 daughter before dying in childbirth, with what would have been their 2nd child. The girl, christened Bertha Zimmermann, grew up in the shadow of her mother's memory and her father's growing bitterness. The village records, maintained by Father Heinrich Müller at St. Bartholomew's Church, noted Margaret's death with unusual detail for such documents. The priest had written in the margins of the burial registry that the woman had spoken strange words in her final moments, though he crossed out these notations so thoroughly that only fragments remained legible decades later. The official cause of death was listed as complications from childbirth, but the midwife, Anna Hoffmann, never spoke of what she had witnessed in that upstairs room. After Margaret's funeral, Anna moved to her sister's farm near Frankfurt and was never seen in Steinfeld again. Young Bertha Zimmermann possessed an unusual beauty that made the village women lower their voices when she passed. Her hair was the color of wheat in autumn sunlight, and her eyes held a depth that seemed inappropriate for a child. She moved with a grace that suggested careful training, though no one remembered seeing her receive instruction in deportment or dance. The girl helped her father in his workshop, sorting wood shavings and organizing tools with a precision that impressed even the most demanding customers. Wilhelm's reputation as a craftsman grew throughout the region during those early years of widowerhood. His furniture appeared in the homes of merchants and minor nobility as far away as Mainz. The intricate carvings that decorated his work became his signature, though some clients complained that the patterns seemed to shift when viewed from different angles, creating an unsettling effect that made them reluctant to display the pieces prominently. In 1808, Wilhelm married his 2nd wife, Frieda Weber, a woman of 35 who had never found a husband despite her family's modest wealth. Frieda came from the neighboring village of Oberursel, where her father operated a successful grain mill. She brought with her 2 daughters from a previous engagement that had ended under circumstances no one discussed openly. The elder daughter, Clotilde Weber, was 16 and possessed the kind of sharp features that made mothers keep their sons close. The younger, Kunigunde Weber, was 14 and had inherited her mother's calculating nature, along with a voice that could carry across 3 houses when she chose to raise it. The marriage ceremony took place on a February morning when the ground lay frozen and the sky promised snow. Father Müller performed the service with unusual haste, later noting in his personal diary that he had felt compelled to complete the ritual before the sun reached its zenith. The wedding feast was modest, attended only by immediate family and a few neighbors who left early, claiming suddenly remembered obligations. From the moment Frieda Weber became Frieda Zimmermann, the dynamics within the house began to shift in ways that would not become apparent until years later. The new wife took immediate control of the household management, relegating 12-year-old Bertha to increasingly menial tasks. What began as reasonable expectations for a young woman's education in domestic skills gradually expanded into something that resembled servitude more than family responsibility. The village blacksmith, Johann Brenner, later recalled noticing changes in Bertha's appearance during the months following her father's remarriage. Her dresses became simpler, less well-maintained. Her hands, once soft despite her work in the carpentry shop, developed calluses that spoke of harsher labor. Most notably, she began to move differently, with the careful, measured steps of someone who had learned to avoid drawing attention to herself. Wilhelm seemed oblivious to these changes, or perhaps he chose not to see them. His work consumed more of his time, and his commissions took him away from Steinfeld for days at a stretch. When he was home, he spent his evenings in the workshop behind the house, where the sound of his tools continued long after sunset. Neighbors reported seeing lamplight in the workshop windows well past midnight, though the precise nature of his nocturnal activities remained unknown. The first winter of the new family arrangement passed without incident that anyone recorded officially. The spring of 1809 brought unusual weather patterns that local farmers still discussed decades later. The last frost came in early May, destroying much of the early plantings and forcing families to rely more heavily on preserved foods and stored grains. In such circumstances, household economies became matters of survival rather than comfort. It was during this period of scarcity that Bertha's role in the household became more clearly defined. Church records from that spring include a notation by Father Müller regarding confession schedules, in which he observed that the young woman had begun attending services alone, arriving before dawn to pray in the empty sanctuary. The priest noted that she always knelt in the same location, before the statue of St. Agatha, and that her prayers seemed to follow a pattern he could not quite decipher. The transformation of the Zimmermann household from a place of mourning to something else entirely took place so gradually that individual changes seemed insignificant when viewed in isolation. Frieda's daughters adapted to their new home with an ease that suggested they had prepared for this relocation well before the wedding. Clotilde assumed responsibility for maintaining the family's social connections within the village, while Kunigunde focused on domestic management with an attention to detail that impressed the neighbors. Bertha's responsibilities, meanwhile, expanded to include tasks that traditionally fell to hired help or younger children. She rose before dawn to start the cooking fires and prepare the morning meal. Her days filled with laundry, cleaning, food preparation, and maintenance of the workshop tools. By evening, when the family gathered for their final meal, she often appeared too exhausted to participate in conversation. The village women noticed these changes, but interpreted them within the context of normal family dynamics. A stepmother's need to establish authority, a young woman's preparation for her eventual marriage and household management, a father's preoccupation with his trade, all seemed reasonable explanations for what they observed. The fact that Bertha never complained, never appeared at the well with tales of mistreatment, actually reinforced their conclusion that the arrangement was working satisfactorily. However, certain details began to accumulate that would later assume greater significance. The baker's wife, Elizabeth Schneider, mentioned to her sister that young Bertha had stopped purchasing the sweetbreads she had once enjoyed. The cloth merchant, Heinrich Vogel, noted that the family no longer bought fabric suitable for a young woman's dresses, though they continued to purchase materials for the stepsister's clothing. Most telling, perhaps, was the observation made by the church organist, Greta Fischer, that Bertha had developed the habit of flinching when people approached her unexpectedly. The first explicit indication that something was seriously wrong came in the autumn of 1810, when Dr. Andreas Hartmann was summoned to treat what Frieda described as a fever. The physician's notes, discovered years later among his papers, described injuries inconsistent with illness, bruising around the wrists, burns on the hands that appeared to have been inflicted deliberately, and evidence of malnutrition despite the family's apparent prosperity. Dr. Hartmann questioned Bertha privately, but she insisted that her injuries resulted from clumsiness in the kitchen and workshop. Her explanation was delivered in such a practiced manner that the physician suspected she had rehearsed these responses. When he attempted to examine her more thoroughly, she became agitated and begged him not to tell her family that she had discussed her condition. The doctor noted in his journal that evening that the young woman's terror seemed disproportionate to the situation, suggesting she feared consequences beyond normal parental displeasure. The physician attempted to speak with Wilhelm about his daughter's condition, but the carpenter dismissed the concerns with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface. Bertha was naturally clumsy, had always been prone to accidents, worked too eagerly to help the family, and sometimes injured herself in her enthusiasm. Wilhelm's manner during this conversation struck Dr. Hartmann as oddly detached, as though he was discussing a piece of furniture rather than his only biological child. What Dr. Hartmann could not have known was that his visit triggered a series of conversations within the Zimmermann household that would fundamentally alter Bertha's situation. Frieda interpreted the physician's inquiries as a threat to the family's reputation and privacy. In the days following the doctor's visit, Bertha's access to the village became increasingly restricted. She no longer appeared at the market, the well, or church services with the regularity that had characterized her earlier adolescence. The explanation provided to curious neighbors was that Bertha was dedicating herself more completely to domestic responsibilities in preparation for her eventual marriage. At 17, she was approaching the age when young women began seriously considering their matrimonial prospects. Frieda mentioned to several families that they were considering matches with young men from neighboring villages, though no specific names or arrangements were ever discussed publicly. This explanation satisfied most villagers, but Father Müller continued to wonder about the young woman's absence from regular services. He made several attempts to visit the Zimmermann house for pastoral calls, but found that Bertha was always occupied with tasks that prevented her from speaking with him privately. When he did see her, usually briefly at the front door, she appeared increasingly thin and spoke in monosyllables that suggested either extreme shyness or fear. The winter of 1810 to 1811 proved particularly harsh, with snowfall that lasted from November through March, and temperatures that froze the wells for weeks at a time. During this period, Bertha's isolation from the village became complete. The official explanation was that the family was conserving resources and limiting unnecessary exposure to the cold, but the practical effect was that she disappeared from public view entirely. When spring arrived and she did not resume her previous patterns of movement through the village, a few residents began to ask more direct questions. These inquiries were met with increasingly elaborate explanations from Frieda and her daughters. Bertha was unwell, they said, suffering from a nervous condition that required rest and limited stimulation. She was devoted to her prayers and spent much of her time in contemplation. She was learning advanced domestic skills that required complete concentration. The truth, as it would eventually emerge, was far more disturbing than anyone in the village could have imagined. Bertha's transformation from Wilhelm's cherished daughter to her stepfamily's servant had been accomplished through a combination of psychological manipulation and physical coercion that began almost immediately after Frida's arrival in the household. The process had started subtly, with small adjustments to routines and expectations that seemed reasonable individually, but combined to systematically isolate Bertha from sources of support and validation. Her father's attention was redirected through careful manipulation of his work schedule and social obligations. Her access to the village was gradually restricted through increasingly elaborate justifications. Her physical needs were met at subsistence levels, while her stepsisters enjoyed comfort and abundance. More significantly, Bertha had been subjected to what could only be described as a campaign of psychological conditioning designed to make her compliant and silent. She was repeatedly told that her mother's death had been her fault, that she was a burden on the family, that any attempt to seek help from outsiders would result in consequences too terrible to imagine. These messages were reinforced through a system of punishments and rewards that gradually broke down her sense of self-worth and independence. By the winter of 1811, Bertha had effectively ceased to exist as an individual within her own family. She had become a function rather than a person, valued only for the labor she could provide and the silence she maintained. Her step-family had successfully created a situation where she participated in her own oppression, convinced that any alternative would be worse than her current circumstances. The village continued to function around this hidden horror, its residents unaware that they were living alongside one of the most systematic cases of domestic abuse that would ever be documented in the region. The Zimmermann house maintained its respectable facade, Wilhelm continued to produce his acclaimed furniture, and Frida established herself as a pillar of local society. The only sign that something was amiss was the absence of one young woman who had once been a familiar presence in their daily lives. What happened next would transform this hidden tragedy into something that resonated far beyond the borders of Steinfeld. The events of 1812 would ensure that the name Aschenputtel would be remembered long after the true story had been forgotten. Though whether this transformation represented justice or further victimization remained a matter of perspective that would haunt anyone who learned the complete truth. In the early months of 1812, several factors converged to destabilize the carefully maintained equilibrium within the Zimmermann household. Wilhelm received a commission that would require him to travel to Hanover for an extended period, leaving the house under Frida's complete control. Clotilde, now 20, had attracted the attention of a merchant's son from Wiesbaden, creating the possibility of an advantageous marriage that would remove her from the household permanently. Most significantly, Kunigunde had begun to exhibit signs of the same nervous condition that had been used to explain Bertha's seclusion, though in her case the symptoms appeared to be genuine manifestations of guilt and fear. The commission that took Wilhelm to Hanover came from Baron Friedrich von Steinberg, who required furniture for a hunting lodge he was constructing in the Harz Mountains. The work would involve not only creating the pieces, but installing them on site, a process that would keep Wilhelm away from Steinfeld for at least 6 weeks. For Frida, this represented an opportunity to address what she saw as the ongoing problem of Bertha's presence in the household. During the years since her marriage to Wilhelm, Frida had invested considerable energy in establishing her daughter's prospects within local society. Both young women needed to make advantageous marriages if the family was to maintain and improve its social position. Bertha's continued presence complicated these efforts, not because she competed with her stepsisters for attention, but because her obvious mistreatment raised questions about the household's character that potential suitors might find troubling. The solution Frida had developed involved removing Bertha from the equation entirely. She had made inquiries about convents that accepted young women without substantial dowries, particularly those that specialized in caring for individuals with nervous conditions or mental instability. The Abbey of St. Marienburg, located near Boppard on the Rhine, had indicated willingness to accept Bertha as a postulant, provided that her condition was properly documented by appropriate authorities. Dr. Hartmann, despite his earlier concerns about the young woman's well-being, could be persuaded to provide the necessary certification. Frida had already begun laying the groundwork for this arrangement by emphasizing Bertha's supposed religious devotion and desire for a contemplative life. The story would be that the young woman had experienced a calling to religious service and wished to dedicate her life to prayer and service within the convent walls. However, this plan required Bertha's cooperation, or at least her inability to contradict the narrative that would accompany her commitment to the religious life. Frida had become increasingly concerned that her stepdaughter might attempt to communicate with her father before his departure or find some way to alert the village to her true circumstances. To prevent this possibility, Frida decided to accelerate the timeline for Bertha's removal from the household. On the night before Wilhelm's scheduled departure for Hanover, Frida prepared what she described to her daughters as a special tea to help Bertha sleep peacefully during her father's absence. The preparation contained ingredients that Frida had obtained from an herbalist in Frankfurt, substances that would ensure the young woman remained unconscious for an extended period. The plan was to transport Bertha to the convent while she was unconscious, accompanied by documentation that would make her subsequent claims of mistreatment appear to be manifestations of mental instability. Kunigunde, who had participated in her mother's campaign against Bertha for 3 years, found herself unable to watch this final step in the process. As she helped prepare the evening meal that would be Bertha's last in the house where she was born, the 18-year-old began to experience what she would later describe as a complete breakdown of her resolve. The guilt that had been accumulating for years suddenly became unbearable, and she found herself questioning not just this specific plan, but everything her family had done since arriving in Steinfeld. The confrontation that followed would determine the fate of everyone in the household. Kunigunde's attempt to warn Bertha about the drug tea precipitated a crisis that exposed the full extent of the abuse that had been hidden from the village for nearly 4 years. What happened in the Zimmermann house that night would echo through the community for generations, though the official records would bear little resemblance to the truth that unfolded behind those carefully maintained walls. Bertha's response to her stepsister's warning revealed the depth of conditioning she had undergone during her years of captivity within her own home. Rather than fleeing or seeking help, she initially refused to believe that her step-family intended to harm her permanently. She had become so accustomed to psychological manipulation that she interpreted Kunigunde's warning as another test of her loyalty and obedience. Only when she saw her father's traveling bags already packed did she begin to understand that something irreversible was about to occur. The realization that she was about to be permanently separated from the only life she had ever known triggered a response in Bertha that surprised everyone, including herself. Years of systematic oppression had not entirely destroyed her survival instincts, and faced with the prospect of losing even the minimal existence she had maintained in her father's house, she began to fight back with a desperation that transformed the quiet victim into something far more dangerous. What followed was not the dramatic confrontation that later storytellers would imagine, but a desperate struggle that revealed the true character of everyone involved. Frida attempted to implement her plan despite Kunigunde's betrayal, insisting that Bertha drink the prepared tea while Clotilde held her arms. The physical struggle that ensued awakened neighbors who heard sounds of violence that contradicted years of carefully maintained appearances. Johann Brenner, the blacksmith who lived in the adjacent house, later testified that the sounds coming from the Zimmermann residence that night included screaming, the crash of breaking furniture, and what appeared to be multiple voices raised in argument or distress. He debated whether to investigate, but years of respecting the privacy of his neighbors made him hesitant to intrude on what might be a family matter. The decision was taken from him when Kunigunde appeared at his door, her dress torn and her face marked by scratches that suggested she had been in a physical altercation. She begged him to come immediately, saying that her mother was killing Bertha and that she could not stop what was happening. Johann roused his wife and oldest son before following Kunigunde back to the Zimmermann house, where they found a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bertha lay unconscious in the kitchen, blood seeping from a wound on her head where she had been struck with an iron pot. Frida stood over her with a carving knife from Wilhelm's workshop, while Clotilde held a length of rope that appeared to have been intended for restraining the unconscious young woman. The overturned furniture and scattered contents of the drugged tea suggested that the struggle had been violent and prolonged. Johann's immediate concern was for Bertha's life, but as he knelt to examine her injuries, Frida began to speak with a calmness that was more disturbing than any display of emotion would have been. She explained that Bertha had suffered a fit of madness brought on by her father's departure and had attacked her stepfamily without provocation. The injuries, she claimed, were the result of their attempts to subdue her for her own safety and the protection of others. This explanation might have been accepted if not for Kunigunde's presence and her immediate contradiction of her mother's account. The young woman, still shaking from the violence she had witnessed and participated in, began to describe the years of abuse that had been hidden from the village. Her testimony, delivered in broken sentences interrupted by tears and gasps for breath, revealed systematic starvation, physical beating, psychological torture, and a plan to dispose of Bertha by committing her to a convent under false pretenses. Johann found himself in a situation that exceeded anything in his experience as a village craftsman and occasional arbitrator of minor disputes. The scene before him suggested criminal activity that required intervention by authorities beyond the local level, but the implications for the community were staggering. The Zimmermann family was prominent within Steinfeld's social hierarchy. Wilhelm was respected throughout the region for his craftsmanship, and any scandal involving them would reflect on everyone who had failed to recognize or address the abuse. The immediate question was whether Bertha would survive her injuries. Johann sent his son to wake Dr. Hartmann, while his wife attempted to stop the bleeding from the head wound. The physician arrived within an hour and worked by lamplight to stabilize the young woman's condition. His examination revealed not just the fresh injuries from that night's violence, but evidence of prolonged abuse that made him realize his earlier concerns had been woefully inadequate. Dr. Hartmann's medical notes from that night, preserved in his personal files, described injuries that told a story of systematic brutality extending over several years. Bertha's body bore scars from burns, cuts, and repeated beatings that had been carefully inflicted to avoid areas that would be visible when she was clothed. More significantly, her physical development had been stunted by malnutrition, and her responses to stimulation suggested neurological damage that might be permanent. As dawn approached, the physician faced a decision that would determine not only Bertha's fate, but the future of everyone involved in the night's events. The injuries he had documented constituted clear evidence of criminal abuse that should be reported to civil authorities. However, Bertha remained unconscious and unable to provide testimony about her experiences. Kunigunde's account while consistent with the physical evidence, came from someone who had participated in the abuse and might be considered an unreliable witness. More complicated was the question of what would happen to Bertha if her step-family faced legal consequences for their actions. She had no other family in the region, no independent means of support, and no skills beyond domestic labor. If Wilhelm was informed of the situation, he might return from Hanover to face charges as an accessory to the abuse. If he was not informed, Bertha would become the responsibility of local authorities who were ill-equipped to care for someone with her physical and psychological damage. Father Müller arrived at the house as Dr. Hartmann was completing his examination. The priest had been summoned by Johann's wife, who felt that the situation required spiritual as well as medical intervention. Father Müller's presence added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation, as the Church maintained its own systems of justice and social control that might conflict with civil authorities. The conversation that took place in the Zimmermann kitchen as the sun rose over Steinfeld would determine how the events of that night were recorded in official documents and remembered by the community. The participants included Dr. Hartmann, Father Müller, Johann Brenner and his wife Kunigunde and Clotilde, with Frida remaining silent after her initial attempt to control the narrative had been undermined by her own daughter's testimony. What they decided would transform a clear case of criminal abuse into something more ambiguous and ultimately more troubling. The official record would describe a tragic accident in which a young woman with a history of nervous conditions suffered injuries during a family dispute. Frida and Clotilde would be quietly relocated to live with relatives in another region, while Kunigunde remained in Steinfeld under the supervision of Father Müller. Wilhelm would be informed that his daughter had died from complications related to her long-standing health problems. This solution satisfied the immediate need to end the abuse and remove the perpetrators from the community, while avoiding a scandal that would damage Steinfeld's reputation. However, it also meant that Bertha Zimmermann would officially cease to exist, replaced by a nameless young woman with no past or future who became the ward of St. Bartholomew's Church. The person she had been before her stepfamily's arrival would be erased as completely as if she had never been born. The transformation of Bertha into someone else required more than just changing her name and living situation. Her physical recovery took months, during which time her memories of her life before the abuse remained fragmentary and unreliable. Father Müller, who took responsibility for her care, decided that helping her forget her past entirely might be the most merciful approach to her rehabilitation. The process of creating a new identity for the young woman involved constructing a complete fictional background that would explain her presence in the community and provide a foundation for whatever future she might have. She became Anna Müller, an orphan from a village destroyed during the wars with France, who had been placed in the care of the Church after wandering for months through the countryside. This story explained her physical condition, her fragmented memories, and her need for extensive care and supervision. Anna Müller bore little resemblance to Bertha Zimmermann beyond their shared physical features. Where Bertha had been quiet and compliant, Anna was suspicious and defensive. Where Bertha had moved with careful precision, Anna's gestures were abrupt and startled. Most significantly, Anna showed no recognition of people who had known Bertha for years, treating long-time neighbors as strangers and reacting with fear to situations that should have been familiar. The villagers accepted this transformation because they wanted to believe that the nightmare that had unfolded in the Zimmermann house was truly over. Anna's presence among them represented redemption and healing, rather than a constant reminder of their collective failure to protect one of their own. They could be kind to Anna in ways they had never managed to be protective of Bertha, and this allowed them to feel better about themselves and their community. Father Müller's decision to erase Bertha's past and create Anna's present was motivated by genuine compassion, but it also served the interests of everyone who had been complicit in the abuse through their silence and inaction. By accepting that Bertha was dead and Anna was someone entirely different, the village could move forward without confronting the uncomfortable questions about how such systematic cruelty could have flourished among people who considered themselves decent and Christian. Wilhelm Zimmermann received the news of his daughter's death while working in the Baron's hunting lodge near Goslar. The letter from Father Müller described a sudden illness that had developed into complications too severe for Dr. Hartmann to treat. By the time Wilhelm could arrange to return to Steinfeld, the funeral had already taken place, and his wife and her daughters had departed for their new home in Hessen. Wilhelm's grief was complicated by his growing realization that he had been systematically excluded from his daughter's life during the final years of her existence. When he examined her room, he found evidence of living conditions that resembled imprisonment more than family life. The few possessions she had been allowed to keep were worn beyond normal use, and the space itself had been stripped of anything that might provide comfort or personal expression. The carpenter's guilt was too overwhelming to bear in Steinfeld, where every familiar location reminded him of his failure as a father and protector. He sold the house and workshop within weeks of his return and used the proceeds to commission a memorial window for St. Bartholomew's Church. The window depicted St. Agatha, the patron saint of women who suffered abuse, surrounded by intricate patterns that incorporated motifs from his most delicate woodworking. Wilhelm himself disappeared from the historical record after completing the memorial window. Some said he had joined a monastery, others that he had traveled to the New World to escape his memories. The truth was that he had chosen to follow his daughter into non-existence, abandoning his name and identity as completely as circumstances had forced her to abandon hers. The memorial window remained in St. Bartholomew's Church for more than 2 centuries, though few who admired its craftsmanship knew the story behind its creation. The patterns in the glass seemed to shift in different light, creating images that suggested faces, hands, and other human forms that appeared and disappeared depending on the viewer's perspective. Children who attended services often claimed they could see a young woman in the window, though adults dismissed these observations as imagination. Anna Müller lived in Steinfeld for 7 years after her transformation, working as a servant in Father Müller's household and occasionally helping other families with domestic tasks. She never married, never formed close friendships, and never spoke about her past or her plans for the future. Her existence was quiet and unremarkable, which seemed to be exactly what everyone involved hoped to achieve. In 1819, Anna disappeared from the village as suddenly as she had appeared in her new identity. Father Müller reported that she had expressed a desire to join a convent dedicated to caring for wounded soldiers returning from the wars. No one in Steinfeld ever saw her again, though rumors occasionally surfaced of a woman matching her description working in hospitals or orphanages in distant cities. The official records of Steinfeld contain no mention of the events that took place in the Zimmermann house during the winter of 1812. Bertha Zimmermann's death was recorded in the church registry with minimal details, while Anna Müller's presence in the community was never formally documented. The house itself changed hands several times over the following decades, though tenants often complained of strange noises and unexplained phenomena that made long-term residence difficult. The story might have ended there, forgotten like so many other tragedies that rural communities preferred to bury rather than examine. However, the narrative that emerged from the Zimmermann house had taken on a life of its own, spreading through the region in the form of cautionary tales and moral lessons that bore little resemblance to the truth, but captured something essential about the horror that had unfolded behind closed doors. It was this distorted version of events that reached the brothers Grimm during their collection of folk tales in the German countryside. The story they recorded as Aschenputtel incorporated elements that clearly derived from what happened to Bertha Zimmermann, but transformed the abuse into a fairy tale where virtue was rewarded and evil was punished. In their version, the suffering was temporary and the ending was happy, providing the moral clarity that the real events had notably lacked. The transformation of Bertha's story into Aschenputtel represented the ultimate victory of those who had wanted to forget rather than confront the truth of what had happened in Steinfeld. The fairy tale buried the real story so completely that subsequent generations would never recognize the connection between the charming narrative of the glass slipper and the brutal reality of systematic domestic abuse that had inspired it. Yet certain elements of the original story persisted in the folk version, suggesting that the truth had a power that could not be entirely suppressed. The emphasis on ashes and cinders echoed the burns that had scarred Bertha's hands and arms. The motif of impossible tasks reflected the endless labor that had filled her days. Most significantly, the theme of transformation and recognition spoke to the fundamental question of identity that had been central to her experience. The real Cinderella had been not a servant girl waiting for rescue by a prince, but a daughter destroyed by those who should have protected her, a victim transformed into a survivor, and ultimately a human being who had been erased so thoroughly that even her story became someone else's. The fairy tale ending was not her rescue, but her disappearance, not her recognition, but her obliteration. In 1868, renovation of St. Bartholomew's Church required the temporary removal of Wilhelm Zimmermann's memorial window. Workers discovered that the window had been constructed with unusual techniques that created optical effects impossible to achieve with standard methods. More disturbing, examination of the glass revealed that some of the patterns had been created by embedding organic materials between layers of glass, materials that analysis suggested might be human hair. The discovery prompted an investigation into the window's history that uncovered fragments of the story that had been carefully hidden for more than 50 years. Church records that had been misfiled or deliberately mislabeled contained references to the events of 1812, though the accounts were so heavily edited and annotated that reconstructing the truth required considerable interpretation. Dr. Franz Weber, the physician who conducted this investigation, was disturbed by the parallels between what he uncovered and the folk tale that had become popular throughout Germany. His research notes, preserved in the archives of the University of Frankfurt, described his growing conviction that the Aschenputtel story recorded by the brothers Grimm was based on a real case of criminal abuse that had been covered up by local authorities. Dr. Weber's attempts to publish his findings were blocked by church officials who argued that sensationalizing old tragedies served no useful purpose. The materials he had gathered were classified as confidential and sealed in archives that would not be opened again until well into the 20th century. The memorial window was reinstalled in the church, though the documentation of its construction techniques was deliberately omitted from official records. The investigation did produce one unexpected result. Among the documents Dr. Weber examined was a letter written by someone identifying herself as Anna Miller to Father Miller in 1852. The letter, sent from a convent in Bavaria, described the writer's work caring for children who had been abandoned or abused by their families. She wrote that her own experiences had given her unique insight into the needs of such children, and that she had found purpose in helping them recover from trauma. The letter was signed with a name that meant nothing to Dr. Weber, but it included a reference that suggested the writer remembered more of her past than anyone had realized. She mentioned dreaming about a window filled with patterns that moved like living things, and wondering whether such a window actually existed or was simply a product of her imagination. This detail, which corresponded to Wilhelm Zimmermann's memorial window, convinced Dr. Weber that Anna Müller had retained some memory of her previous identity, despite all attempts to erase it. The letter also contained a postscript that would haunt Dr. Weber for the rest of his career. Anna wrote that she had recently heard the story of Aschenputtel and found it both familiar and deeply disturbing. She wondered whether such stories helped people understand suffering, or simply made it easier to ignore by transforming real pain into entertainment. She hoped that whoever had inspired such tales had found peace, though she feared that peace might only come through being completely forgotten. This was the last documented trace of either Bertha Zimmermann or Anna Müller. The woman who had endured years of abuse, survived attempted murder, and been forced to abandon her identity, had spent her final decades caring for others who had suffered similar experiences. Whether she found the peace she hoped for, or whether her service to damaged children represented a continuation of the trauma that had defined her life, remained questions that Dr. Weber could not answer. The sealed archives that contained Dr. Weber's research were finally opened in 1963 as part of a comprehensive review of church historical documents. By then, most of the people who might have remembered the events in Steinfeld were dead, and the village itself had been largely abandoned following economic changes that made small-scale agriculture unviable. The revelation that one of the most beloved fairy tales in German literature was based on a real case of child abuse created considerable controversy among scholars and the general public. Some argued that the brothers Grimm should have investigated the stories they collected more thoroughly before transforming them into children's entertainment. Others maintained that the fairy tale version served important purposes that would be undermined by dwelling on the brutal reality that inspired it. The debate eventually subsided as public attention turned to more contemporary concerns, but questions about the relationship between folklore and historical truth continued to trouble researchers who studied the darker origins of popular stories. The Aschenputtel case became a touchstone for discussions about how societies process traumatic events and whether transformation into myth represents healing or merely another form of concealment. Modern scholars who have examined the available evidence generally agree that something resembling the events described in Dr. Weber's research did occur in Steinfeld during the early 19th century. The details may have been embellished or distorted through transmission across generations, but the core narrative of systematic abuse within a respectable family, community complicity through silence, and ultimate cover-up rather than justice appears to be based on historical fact. What remains unknown is whether the transformation of this tragedy into the Aschenputtel fairy tale represented an unconscious attempt by the culture to process trauma it could not directly confront, or simply reflected the natural tendency of oral tradition to evolve in directions that serve the psychological needs of storytellers and audiences. Either way, the result was the same. A real victim's suffering became the foundation for a story that made people feel better about the world, rather than forcing them to confront its capacity for cruelty. The house in Steinfeld, where the Zimmermann family lived, was finally demolished in 1972 to make way for a modern road. Workers clearing the site reported finding unusual items buried in what had been the basement, fragments of children's toys, pieces of cloth that might have been clothing, and numerous small bones that forensic examination could not definitively identify as either animal or human. The most disturbing discovery was a wooden box containing what appeared to be personal artifacts: a lock of blonde hair, a small cross, several pages covered with childish handwriting, and a carving knife that bore traces of substances that forensic analysis could not identify after more than a century. These items were turned over to local authorities, who decided that the potential historical significance did not justify the expense and controversy of a full archaeological investigation. The artifacts were stored in a municipal warehouse where they remained forgotten until the building was sold in 1998. The new owners, preparing to convert the space to commercial use, found numerous boxes of unclaimed items dating back decades. Most were disposed of without examination, though a local historian rescued several containers of documents and artifacts that seemed to have potential research value. Among these rescued items was the wooden box from the Zimmermann house site. The historian, Dr. Elizabeth Brown, recognized the potential significance of the contents and attempted to research their origins. Her investigation led her to the sealed church archives and eventually to Dr. Weber's research from the 1860s. The connection between the artifacts and the Aschenputtel story was not immediately obvious, but Dr. Brown's persistence in following documentary trails eventually revealed the relationship. Dr. Brown's research, published in 2003, provided the most complete account of the Bertha Zimmermann case that has been assembled. Her work combined the church documents examined by Dr. Weber with municipal records, property deeds, and other official sources that had been overlooked by earlier researchers. The result was a comprehensive picture of how a community had consciously chosen to forget rather than confront one of the most disturbing crimes in its history. More significantly, Dr. Brown's investigation revealed that the Zimmermann case was not an isolated incident. Similar patterns of abuse, cover-up, and mythologization appeared throughout the region during the same historical period. The transformation of real victims into fairy tale characters seemed to be a systematic phenomenon, rather than a unique occurrence, suggesting that German folk tradition contained numerous stories based on actual crimes that communities had been unwilling or unable to address through normal legal processes. The implications of this discovery extended far beyond academic interest in folklore origins. If traditional stories contained encoded memories of real tragedies, then the analysis of myth and legend might provide insights into historical patterns of abuse and social dysfunction that had been deliberately obscured in official records. The fairy tales that entertained children might actually be repositories of cultural trauma that had been transformed into more palatable forms. Dr. Brown's work also raised uncomfortable questions about the continued popularity of stories like Aschenputtel in contemporary culture. If these narratives were indeed based on real suffering, did their entertainment value depend on the audience's ignorance of their origins? Would people continue to enjoy fairy tales if they understood that the happy endings were fictional additions to stories that originally had no resolution other than the victim's disappearance? The debate that followed Dr. Brown's publication reflected broader cultural uncertainties about how societies should deal with historical trauma. Some argued that revealing the dark origins of beloved stories served no constructive purpose and merely destroyed innocent pleasures for the sake of academic sensationalism. Others maintained that understanding the true history behind mythologized narratives was essential for recognizing similar patterns in contemporary society. The controversy eventually faded, as such academic disputes typically do, but the questions raised by the Zimmermann case continued to resonate among researchers studying the intersection of folklore and social pathology. The realization that some of humanity's most cherished stories might be based on real atrocities that were too painful for societies to acknowledge directly added a new dimension to the study of cultural memory and collective psychology. Today, visitors to the region where Steinfeld once stood find no trace of the village or its history. The area has been incorporated into a nature preserve. and the locations where specific events took place can no longer be identified with certainty. St. Bartholomew's Church was relocated stone by stone to a museum in Wiesbaden, where it serves as an example of rural religious architecture rather than a monument to concealed tragedy. Wilhelm Zimmermann's memorial window was destroyed during the church's relocation when museum workers mishandled the delicate glass. The official explanation was that the window's construction techniques were too fragile to survive the move, though some involved in the process reported that the glass seemed to shatter spontaneously, as though it had been waiting for an opportunity to finally break free from the patterns that had held it together for so long. The complete disappearance of physical traces from the Zimmermann case reflects a broader pattern in how societies deal with historical events that contradict their preferred narratives about themselves. The transformation of Bertha's story into Aschenputtel was just the first step in a process of concealment and mythology that continues today. The fairy tale survives because it tells people what they want to believe about justice and redemption, while the truth disappeared because it revealed things about human nature and social responsibility that were too uncomfortable to acknowledge. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of the Zimmermann case may not be the specific acts of cruelty that one family inflicted on a vulnerable member, but the systematic way in which an entire community chose to participate in erasing those acts from memory. The real horror was not what happened to Bertha, but how easily everyone involved convinced themselves that forgetting was more important than remembering, that protecting their own comfort was more valuable than seeking justice for someone who could no longer seek it for herself. The story of Aschenputtel continues to be told to children around the world, carrying within its familiar narrative the encoded memory of suffering that was too real for its original audience to face directly. Every time the tale is repeated, Bertha Zimmermann is forgotten a little more completely, her actual experience further obscured by the beautiful lie that replaced it. The glass slipper that transformed her into a princess was actually the silence that made her disappear, and the happy ending was not her rescue, but her obliteration.